What kind of hand could hold the sun without burning? What kind of sorrow does it take to carry the light not for oneself, but for a world that has forgotten the warmth? They say there was once a giant whose back was scorched by the fire of heaven, not because he defied it, but because he bore it, not in pride, but in grief, not as a curse, but as a vow. Before the rivers knew names, before the prophets dared to whisper in the winds, before the stars were called to witness the falling of kings, there was one who stood between the fire and the dark, a giant, ancient, grieving, nameless to the world but not to the one who sees all. And it is said even now, when the sun rises low and the sky bleeds gold before sleep, you can feel his breath in the heat. You can hear his footsteps in the silence between birdsong and prayer. You can almost feel the weight, not of flame, but of mercy, carried high on a back carved from stone and story. This is not his tale, it is his burden. And I will not tell it as a story. I will tell it as a prayer, the kind you whisper when you are alone and the light has forgotten your name. The earth was still young, though not in years, in silence. Its rivers had not yet learned to sing. Its winds had not yet been named. And the sun, oh the sun, it had not yet risen in the way we know it now, bold, blazing, high upon the shoulders of time. No, it came gently then, like a wound learning to close, like breath on the back of the neck. It rose low, slow, trembling, for it had seen too much. And beneath this fragile sky there walked the first ones. Not men, not angels, not beasts, giants. Not as the scrolls would later describe them, cruel, boastful destroyers of vineyards and daughters. No, these were older still, made not from arrogance but from the hush between God's words, formed of the same dust as Adam but given bones of dusk and breath of flame. They were the watchers before the watchers, the ones who guarded the sleeping edge of the world when it was too afraid to dream. And among them he stood tallest, not in height but in burden. He did not speak often, but when he did, his voice cracked the mountains from within, not from rage, from remembering. They say the stars bowed before him once, not because he ruled them, but because he had carried them. In his chest, in the hollows of his shoulders, in the fire that still flickered in his spine, though the heavens had long since turned their face. His name was not given, for it could not be pronounced. It was written in the trembling of leaves before dawn, in the hush of earth before thunder. But in the stories that survived, they simply called him the giant who carried the sun, not because he wanted to, because he had to. You see, there was a time before time when light was shared, not ruled, when fire did not burn but warmed, when heaven still touched the earth not with judgment but with longing, but something had gone wrong. And though no scroll dares write it, the old ones whispered of it, an ancient rebellion, yes, but not in the heavens, a rebellion of forgetting. Mankind had not yet been born, and already the world had turned its face from the mercy that made it, and so the fire dimmed, the light hid. The sun, ashamed of its own power, began to sink, and the world grew cold. It is said that God, not out of wrath but sorrow, allowed the sun to fall, not as punishment but as a silence. And in that silence the giants gathered, not to rule but to protect. For though they were made of stone and flame, they remembered the softness of God's first breath, and they mourned, many wept. But he, the nameless one, he stood. He looked at the falling sun, its great eye dimming in the east, and he did not speak. He knelt, and the earth broke beneath his knees. The others watched. They whispered, "Will you die for it?" And he answered, "I already have." Then with hands that had once held stars like pearls, he reached toward the crumbling sun. It did not want to be held, it screamed, it burned, but he did not let go. And so it clung to him, not willingly but desperately, like a child who does not want to be loved but needs it more than breath. And as the fire poured down his back, carving rivers of gold into his flesh, he rose, not as a king, not as a god, as a bearer, the first light bearer. He took the sun into his spine, into his scars, into the sacred architecture of his bones. And from that day on the world woke, not because the sky commanded it, but because a giant held the light high enough for life to remember itself. But it cost him. Oh, it cost him. Every dawn was agony, every sunrise a scream. His shadow stretched across valleys like a prayer no one had the courage to answer. Birds did not sing near him. Trees bowed but did not bloom. For the fire he carried was holy, and holiness has always frightened the world it saves. Still he walked, across lands that had never known a name, across sand that remembered Eden's scent, through valleys that had never heard a voice since the angels fell silent. He walked, not to be seen, not to be followed, only so the sun would not fall. If you're still here, perhaps this story was meant for you. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight, and if your heart feels called, press like and subscribe so the next untold chapter finds you. He never screamed, not once, though the sun bled into his flesh like a living curse, though its weight melted mountains beneath his steps, though every breath he took scorched the wind around him into silence. Still, he did not scream. But those who saw him, and there were few, said his eyes burned with something older than fire, older even than sorrow. They burned with memory. The other giants had long since scattered. Some went beneath the mountains, carving chambers into the deep where sunlight never touched. Others walked into the oceans, letting the waves cool what they could not carry. And some simply lay down in the sand and became stone, refusing to rise again. But he remained, the last, the bearer, and though his body grew heavy with molten veins and blistered breath, he did not falter. He walked in silence, slow as prayer, across a world that no longer asked for light but still could not live without it. Some nights he paused, not to rest, for fire does not rest, but to remember. And on one such night, beneath a sky so black it forgot to shimmer, he stood still in a place where no wind dared breathe. The ground there was soft, ash-thick, the remains of something holy that had burned long ago. Perhaps an altar, perhaps a child. None could say. But the moment his heel pressed into that sacred soot, the earth whispered a sound that had not been heard since the first silence. It was the voice of the fire weeping, for even the flame can mourn the ones who carry it. And in that breathless hush, the giant knelt. He placed both hands upon the ground, and the heat from his palms brought life back to the ashes. Tiny red veins of light spread like roots beneath the dust, pulsing slowly, a heartbeat of forgotten flame. And then the memories returned, not to him, to the ground. The trees remembered being green. The birds remembered song. The earth remembered a name it had not dared speak for 1,000 winters. Azurael. It was not his name. It was the name of the one he had loved. Ah, now you see, even giants kneel not just for God. They kneel for the ones who once looked at them without fear, who once touched the burning shoulders without flinching, who once said, "You do not need to carry the sun. It is enough that you carry my hand." Azurael, she had been not giant nor divine, she was something gentler, a creature of clay, perhaps shaped not by flame but by tenderness, a being not made to survive the fire but to soften it, to remind him he was more than his burden, that the light he bore did not make him less able to be held. But fire forgets love when it burns too long, and love forgets how to breathe when it sees its beloved consumed. She had watched him rise. She had seen the sun begin to bind itself to his spine, and she had wept not because he changed, but because the fire would never let him return. They say she followed him for 100 dawns, barefoot through the broken lands, until her skin turned silver from ash and her voice became no louder than dust. She walked beside his shadow, never touching, never calling, just walking, until her body became prayer and her soul returned to the place where all sorrow is folded into stars. Her name became wind. Her memory became silence, but he remembered. He carried not only the sun, he carried her in every blistered step, in every crack of his molten bones, in every sunrise that screamed against the cold. And now, as he knelt in the ash that once held her, the earth rose with him, not in thunder, in softness. Grass did not grow, trees did not bloom, but a single warmth, small, delicate, bloomed within the hollow of his palm. It did not burn, it pulsed, like breath, like love. And it was then he understood. The fire beneath his skin was no longer just the sun. It was her. It was all those who had seen him not as myth, not as punishment, but as soul. And so he rose again, taller than before, though his body now leaned with sorrow. And when the sun woke that morning, it rose not from the east, but from his back. It followed him, willingly. For even light cannot resist the one who bears it with love. There came a day when the sun would not rise. Not because it could not, but because it wept. And the giant, the bearer, stood in the center of a valley so wide that even echoes could not find their way home. He waited, still, shoulders bare, back arched toward the heavens, silent as always. The sun hovered behind him like a wounded child, trembling dim. Its fire flickered as if caught in a dream it no longer believed. The sky was gray, not wit. Clouds with absence. And in the east, where light had once torn open the horizon with color, there was nothing, just stillness. The animals did not stir. The trees did not sway. Even the rivers forgot how to run. The whole world paused. It had happened once before in the beginning when the fire first hid itself in shame, afraid of being misused. But now it was different. The light was not hiding, it was mourning, for it had seen something that shattered it. And though no tongue could speak it clearly, the old stones whispered it anyway. The first war of angels had begun. Not with swords, not with flame, with choice. The kind of choice that tears heaven in half. There had been watchers among the skies, silent ones. Those who looked down upon the earth and saw beauty where they had expected dust. And some, only some, had loved what they saw too much. They descended, not as messengers but as seekers. And when they took what they should have left untouched, the veil between light and ruin thinned. He, the bearer, felt it in his ribs, a shiver through the gold-lined marrow, a grief not his own but heaven's. He knew. The sun wept not because it feared darkness, but because the balance had been broken. That which was meant to protect had fallen in love with its reflection and fallen out of love with the source. It would not rise, not over betrayal, not over blood. And the giant, still kneeling beneath its weight, felt the fire inside him dim. He looked skyward, not to command, not to question, only to listen. But the sky gave no answer. Even God was quiet. It is in such silences that the greatest test begins, when even heaven seems to turn its face and the burden you carry begins to ask if it still matters. He felt it then, the sun trembling on his back, not with pride but with doubt. And in that moment he spoke, not aloud but within. A whisper through the fire in his veins, a prayer made of flame. If you are still watching, let me carry it, not because it shines but because you once told it to rise. The sun stirred, not in joy, in obedience. It lifted again, barely, weak, pale, a morning without gold, and the world did not cheer, the birds did not sing. But somewhere in the distance, a single shepherd opened her eyes and saw the light through the trees. She didn't know why it mattered, only that it did. She lit her lamp and fed her child. The world had survived another dawn, not because it deserved to, because someone unseen had knelt long enough for mercy to remember its way home. That night, when the giant lay down near the roots of a dead olive tree, he did something he had not done in 1,000 years. He closed his eyes and dreamed. He dreamed of the one who first lit the fire, not with judgment but with joy. He dreamed of Azurael walking barefoot across golden rivers, her arms full of sky. He dreamed of a sun that did not burn, only warmed. He dreamed of a world that no longer feared the shoulders that carried it. And when he awoke, the sky was not yet lit, but the stars had come closer, as if to say, we saw, we remember. And still the fire burned, not with fury, with hope. Then let us step deeper into the sacred path where memory becomes myth and myth begins to breathe. There was a mountain that no sun had ever kissed. Its peak was too proud, its slopes too steep, its soul too old. The wind that circled it came not from the heavens above, but from the caverns below, like a sigh rising from something that had been sleeping for far too long. It was not named in any scroll, not etched into the memory of man. But among the few who remembered, it was whispered of as Aranor, the place where fire waits. It was here the giant walked. The one who bore the sun upon his back, not as crown, not as punishment, but as vow. His body had become part flame, part stone. Each step left behind not footprints but scorched emblems, silent scriptures written into the very dust. Trees leaned away as he passed. The wind held its breath, for none had seen him come this far, not even in dream. Why had he come? He did not know. Only that the fire had begun to whisper in his bones, calling him to the mountain as a servant is called to kneel before a throne he cannot see. Not to be judged, but to be remembered. Aranor did not welcome him. It opened before him like a wound, not with paths but with scars. Narrow ridges slick with old blood, stones sharp with prophecy, caves that trembled when no wind touched them. The giant placed a hand on the earth. It flinched, but he whispered to it not in words but in warmth. He reminded the mountain who he was, and the path steadied. He entered. Inside, Aranor was not silent. It sang, not with sound, with temperature. Heat pulsed through the stone like veins of memory. Flickers of flame danced across the walls, though no torch had been lit. Here, the fire was not a guest. It was the host, and deep within the belly of the mountain he saw it, not gold, not treasure, a throne forged not from jewels but from charred bones and silent stone. The kind of stone that remembers who sat upon it last and does not forgive. It was vast, wider than rivers, taller than cathedrals, shaped like the spine of something divine that had been broken and reassembled by sorrow. No one sat upon it. No one dared, for this was not a throne for kings. It was a throne for the one who bore what others could not. He approached, but not to sit, to kneel. And the moment his knees touched the ash-slick floor, the mountain exhaled a single breath, deep as thunder. The throne pulsed, once. Then it began to weep. Ash fell from its arms, flame rose from its base. And for the first time in uncounted ages, Aranor remembered who it had been built for. Not the giant, the fire. For there had once been a time lost even to angels when the flame itself had a throne, not in the sky, not in the heart of stars, in the earth, here, in this mountain. The flame had ruled not as tyrant but as healer. It had shaped, forged, warmed, guided. But when man and jinn forgot its sacredness, it fled. The throne was abandoned until now, until one returned not as God, not as prophet, but as bearer. And the throne recognized the fire within him, not just the sun on his back, but the sorrow in his bones. And it whispered in smoke and light, "You have carried it long enough." But the giant shook his head. He placed one burning hand upon the throne's arm, and the stone glowed as if remembering touch for the first time in an age. He did not speak, he simply breathed, and through him the sun stirred. The fire within the throne flickered. It leaned forward, not like a flame, like a question. And the question was this: if you were offered rest, would you still rise for the ones who do not know your name? And though his lips did not move, his body answered. He rose, turned, and began the climb back out of Aranor, the sun once more settling between his shoulders like a prayer refusing to die. And the throne behind him stayed empty, but no longer forgot. Then let us walk further into the firelight that memory casts on forgotten stone. There are moments when even the eternal begins to question its purpose. And so it was, on the 5th morning after he left Aranor, that the fire within him stirred not with strength, but with doubt. The land had changed. The winds had thickened with sand, and the stars began to vanish behind veils of crimson dust. It was as though the sky itself had grown ashamed to watch. Even the birds, those ancient messengers of silence, flew lower, slower, as if mourning something not yet lost but soon to be. He walked, and the sun, once proud upon his back, flickered now like a tired flame in an old lamp. Its weight shifted, its heat faltered, and then, for the first time since the oath was made, it spoke, not aloud. Not with words, but from within, a tremble in his chest, a warmth that pulsed not like fire but like voice. And the whisper it gave was unlike anything he had carried before. "Why do you still bear me?" He stopped, not in fear, in awe, for this was not the voice of wrath, not the divine thunder he had once imagined. It was a child's question, a question shaped from exhaustion, a question that came from the flame itself, the sun, broken and bewildered. And so he answered, not with words but with memory. He knelt beside a dry riverbed, the same one where he had once watched Azurael collect wild figs with her bare hands, singing a song even the angels did not know. He placed his hand into the dry dust, and he remembered, "Because without you there is no morning." The sun stirred, "But I am not as I was." And he, the bearer, whispered back, "Neither am I." A silence followed, thick, intimate, like the space between two breaths before a confession, and then the flame spoke again. "You could lay me down, you could return to the mountain." The wind paused, even the stars held still, but the giant wept, tears not of sorrow but of tenderness, because only one who had loved deeply could understand what it meant to carry something too sacred to release, even when it asked to be let go. He lifted his eyes to the horizon. Nothing moved. No birds, no beasts, no echoes. Just the silence waiting to be broken. And he said aloud this time, so that even the earth might remember, "I will carry you until you believe in yourself again." And in that moment the fire wept too. A warmth passed through his body, not as agony but as gratitude. The sun, no longer a tyrant of light but a wounded child cradled upon the shoulders of a father too faithful to abandon it. And far away, though none could see, the heavens stirred. The angels who had not fallen looked down, and for the first time in an age they did not weep. They watched. They whispered among themselves, "Behold, one who carries what we fled from." And they bowed their heads not to worship high, but to honor what he bore. For the sun had begun to believe again, not in its strength, in its worth. And that more than heat, more than fire, was what made it rise again. The next dawn came like a breath held too long. It did not blaze, it hummed. It did not scorch, it kissed. And for one sacred morning the world forgot to be afraid of the light. Children woke early. Birds flew higher. The rivers remembered how to dance. And somewhere beneath the soil, a seed once planted by Azurael cracked open, reaching, for the first time, toward warmth that felt like love. And above it all, the giant walked on, his back glowing not with the pride of power, but with the quiet joy of carrying something that had once wanted to die and now dared to shine again. We return now to the sacred path, where even silence is heavy with light, and every step is a psalm not yet written. They say when the light begins to heal, the darkness grows jealous. For what is shadow but the shape made by something standing too close to the flame? And so it was on the seventh day after the sun spoke that something ancient rose from beneath the forgotten edges of the earth, not from the sky, not from the oceans, but from memory. It had no name. Or rather, it had once had many, whispers across forgotten tongues, curses hidden inside lullabies, the kind of names mothers once refused to speak aloud lest the night become too long to bear. It was not a creature. It was not a god. It was the first shadow ever cast by the first fire. And it had been waiting for the sun to falter, for the bearer to kneel too long, for the mountain to remain empty. It rose beneath him like smoke through cracks in sacred stone. No footsteps, no warning, only cold, sharp, creeping, alive. The kind of cold that makes bones forget their name. The giant did not turn, he felt it in his scars, in his spine. The flame flickered, the sun dimmed, and then the voice came, a voice like oil poured into a prayer, thick, imitating mercy, smiling with teeth. "You are tired, fire carrier. Lay it down, let it sink. The world no longer asks for dawn." The giant stood still, the earth beneath him cracked from tension, the fire within him trembling not in fear but in recognition. For this was the voice he had heard once before, not outside but within, on the day he took the flame, on the day the other giants turned away. It had spoken then too. Let the world grow cold, it deserves the silence. And he had not answered, but now the flame inside him was not alone. Now it had begun to believe, and so he turned, slowly, like a mountain remembering how to move. And when his eyes, lit with the sun's quiet pulse, fell upon the shadow, the air itself recoiled. There it stood, the shape of the absence of all things. No eyes, no limbs, just suggestion, as if God had once begun to create it, then thought better. "You are not fire," the giant said, and the shadow smiled. I am what fire leaves behind. It surged. Like night swallowing a prayer. It wrapped itself around him not with force but with persuasion, cold coiling through his thoughts, doubt pressed against his ribs, the weight of every silent dawn he had borne alone. Let go, it hissed. Let someone else rise. And for one flickering moment he almost did. He saw himself stepping aside. He saw the sun falling. He saw Azurael's voice fading into the dust forever. And then he remembered something, not strength, not duty. He remembered her hands. Once long ago, when she had touched his back, she had whispered, "Your fire will never burn me. I was made for its warmth." And with that memory, the flame within him rose like breath pulled from the lungs of the world. It did not roar, it sang. The sun flared not out of rage, but out of love rediscovered. And the shadow screamed. It could not bear belief. It fled not in fear of light, but in fear of the one who still carried it. And the wind returned, and the ground sighed. And the birds above wept in circles. He fell to one knee, not in defeat, in reverence. For he had not only survived, he had remembered. And now something new stirred in the east, not just light, color, not just warmth, song. The sun, stronger now, settled once more upon his back. But this time it was not heavy, it fit. And beneath the earth, in the deep bones of Aranor, the throne glowed softly, as if smiling. Then gather close once more, for the fire still walks among the stones, and the story has not yet slept. It began with a footprint, small, too small, half erased by wind, but still warm. The earth around it had not burned, not fully, just singed like it had been tested, touched, but not judged. He found it near the edge of a sleeping valley where shadows ran long and the sun lingered behind his shoulders, quiet as a loyal friend. The footprint did not belong to a giant, nor an angel, nor a beast of forgotten days. It belonged to a child. He knew this not by sight, but by the silence that surrounded it, a silence different than the one that followed him. This silence waited. The sun flared behind him uncertain, and the giant stood very still. Who would dare walk the path scorched by his fire? Who would survive? He turned his head slowly, and for the first time in centuries he was not alone. She stood not far, no taller than the bend of his knee, her body wrapped in rags that fluttered like prayers in the heat. A girl, mortal, dust in her hair, smoke in her eyes, feet bare. But her gaze was fearless. She did not flinch when his fire cracked the air between them. She did not bow when his shadow fell over her. She did not speak. She just looked, as if she had known him in another life. And perhaps she had. The wind whispered her name to him, not in words, in ache. Luma. He said nothing. But inside the flame stirred. It did not rise. It listened. For the first time it was no longer alone in its bearing. Another fire, smaller, quieter, flickered in this girl's chest. Not given, not cursed. Chosen, she had followed his steps, across valleys turned to glass, across rivers that hissed from his passing, across the bones of temples long devoured by time. She had followed without speaking, without asking. And now she stood, eyes steady, as if to say, "If no one else will carry it after you, I will." He could not remember the last time someone had spoken to him with eyes alone. The sun hesitated. It did not fear her. It feared what it would mean to believe in her. The girl took one step forward. The ground beneath her did not smoke. The fire on his back softened, not dimmed, softened as if reaching toward her without knowing how. And still she did not speak. She knelt, not in worship, in readiness. She placed her hand upon the earth beside his, and the fire recognized her, not fully, but enough. The earth pulsed, not with heat, with memory. Visions passed between them, not of battles, not of gods, but of moments. Luma as a child, tracing flame-like shapes into the dirt with a stick. Luma staring at the sky long after others slept. Luma whispering to embers as if they could hear her, and perhaps they did. She was born not from fire, but toward it, and now the path had brought her here. The giant reached forward, not to lift, not to bless, to share. And for the first time, a portion of the fire moved. It left his spine, drifted like golden mist, and settled near her chest, not into her skin, but around it. Like a promise that had not yet chosen a time to awaken. She gasped. not in fear, in belonging, and he saw something in her eyes that startled even the sun. Hope, not the soft kind, the dangerous kind, the kind that survives silence, the kind that dares to follow giants, the kind that one day may carry the dawn. Then come, for the fire has chosen a second heart, and the story now walks on two sets of feet. She did not sleep that night. She sat by the embers of his silence, watching the shadows curl and uncurl around him like tired serpents, her knees pulled close to her chest, her fingers pressed gently into the soil he had scorched. And he, the giant, watched her in his own way, not with eyes, with fire. The flame within him curled at the edges, puzzled. She should have burned. The ground around her was still warm from his passing, blackened into glass. His breath alone could silence trees, and the sun's quiet weight still rested across his spine like an ancient wound. Yet she remained, unafraid, unsleeping, listening not to him, to the fire, for the flame had begun to speak to her. Softly, like a child learning language again, it brushed her thoughts, it wrapped around her bones, it asked her not to understand but to remember. And she did, not fully, but enough. She remembered heat that did not hurt. She remembered a name that once meant light born from sorrow. She remembered stars folding like petals to let her pass beneath them. She remembered a time before the world was loud, and the fire remembered her. It licked her palms gently. It ran along her spine like gold ink. And the giant, silent beside her, did not intervene. He only watched. For the first time in 1,000 dawns, the fire was no longer only his. It had tasted another soul, and it was pleased, but with this shift came something neither of them expected. The shadows returned, quicker this time, angrier. The same ancient absence that had once tried to consume him now came with greater hunger, for it had felt the fire leave him, even if only a little. It hated division, it hated legacy, and it feared most of all the fire it could not touch. The girl awoke, not from slumber but from stillness, and turned her head toward the dark. She saw nothing, but her breath shortened. The giant stood, a slow rise like mountains learning anger. He felt it too, the ache, the pull, the poison in the air. The shadow came not as a storm this time, it came as a voice, her voice, Azurael's, Kali. "Ng from the dark. It is me," it said. "Come closer, the fire has wounded me. Let me touch it once more before I vanish." The giant froze, not because he believed it, but because he remembered it, those words. She had once spoken them truly on the last day he saw her before the sun bound itself to him. She had whispered that plea into his hands as they caught fire. It was real. And now it had been stolen, used, mocked. His knees shook, not from fear, but from the wound of memory. The girl saw it. She stood, walked slowly to his side, and without asking permission, she placed her hand upon his. The sun flared behind them, not in wrath, in recognition. Voice faltered, the shadow rippled. The giant opened his mouth, and for the first time since Azurael died, he spoke her name aloud. "You are not her." The wind recoiled, the fire sharpened, and Luma whispered beside him, "Let me answer next time." He turned his head, surprised, but in her eyes there was something fierce, not rebellion, inheritance. She did not want to replace him, she wanted to become worthy. And the fire, still wrapped around her chest, pulsed once, like breath shared, like lineage. And that night the shadow did not return, not because it was defeated, but because it realized its battle was no longer with one. Now it was with two. We return once more to the hush where footsteps echo like prophecy, and fire walks hand in hand with its future. Dawn came softly, as if afraid to disturb what had passed in the dark. The birds, those ancient keepers of forgotten prayers, circled far above, uncertain if the world was safe enough to sing. Girl stood alone, some distance from the sleeping giant. The fire had not left her. It clung to her now, not in defiance, but in wonder. She did not wear it like armor, she carried it like breath. She had not yet touched the sun itself, not fully. The portion she bore pulsed gently at her core, golden threads rising and falling like the tide of something older than oceans. It had begun to hum, not aloud inside, a vibration behind her ribs, a melody that felt like grief learning to hope. But now something had shifted. It was time. She did not ask. She did not wait for him to wake. She walked to where he slept, curled like a mountain too exhausted to stand. She knelt beside him, and for the first time she looked directly at the sun on his back. It was not round, not smooth. It was cracked, veined with deep scars of sorrow, molten lines etched like scripture across his shoulder blades. It pulsed with memory, not glory. It ached with light. She placed her palm against it. The moment her skin met the flame, the sky changed. Noon light struck the clouds, though it was barely morning. The trees bowed, the air folded, and the sun roared, but she did not burn, she wept. The fire poured through her arm, through her heart, down her spine. She did not scream. She remembered every wound he had carried, every lonely sunrise, every prayer whispered with no one to answer but ash, every moment he had chosen to rise, even when nothing asked him to. And the fire, startled by her, began to reshape itself around her. Not to consume, to crown. It saw her not as vessel, as voice. And for the first time since Aranor was carved from stone, the sun split. It did not fracture, it multiplied. Two flames, not equal but bound. The one on his back pulsed steady. The one in her hands danced, curious, alive, new. The giant stirred, and when his eyes opened, the sky broke into 1,000 colors never seen by mortals. He did not speak. She did not look at him. She was listening to something he could no longer hear. The fire was speaking to her now directly, without pain, without riddle, and what it said was this: there will come a day when he will fall, and when he does, you must not cry, you must rise, for the fire was never only his. It is older than him, and it has chosen you too. She nodded, one tear, one breath, and she turned toward the east. The sun followed her briefly, not to leave him, to greet her. And in that moment the giant felt something he had not felt in thousands of years: peace. Not because the burden was gone, but because it would not die with him. And far below, in the blackened soil where her footsteps landed, tiny shoots of green began to crack through the ash. The fire had touched the earth through her, and the earth did not flinch. It bloomed. Then gather once more beneath the hush of a waking world, for the fire moves forward now, carried not by one, but by those it has chosen. There had never been a name for him, not truly. The people called him the flame bearer, the sun walker, the one who burned and did not die, but those were titles, not truths. Names, the real ones, are not made from sound. They are breathed into the bones of the world when no one is listening. And until that morning, not even the wind had dared to say his. But now it had learned. It began slowly, ing from the east like a question asked in reverence. The breeze slipped through the hollow spaces in the rocks, curled through dead trees that once refused to whisper, and slid across the scorched earth as if gathering syllables left behind in his footsteps. It circled him as he slept. It circled her as she stood beside him, eyes closed, hands still pulsing with the heat she'd inherited. And then, as the sun climbed just high enough to touch her shoulder, the wind spoke. Not in language, not in thunder, in breath. Kayama, the word was not his, it was him. The sound of what he had become, the truth of the burden, the name given not by birth but by endurance. Kayama. She turned when she heard it, not with fear, with stillness. He stirred. The name passed through his ears like the memory of a song he'd once hummed in a forgotten tongue. He did not smile. He did not rise. He listened. The wind repeated it. Kayama, not louder, deeper. The name curled through the sky, wrapped around mountain bones, slid into the rivers, settled in the cracks of cities long buried. Every place he had walked, remembered. And then he rose, slowly, like the sun. The fire on his back burned quiet, golden, not crimson. His eyes, once dulled by endless dawns, now shimmered. "Did you hear it?" he asked her. She nodded. "Yes, it knows you." He looked east, he looked west, and for the first time since the burden had found him, he said, "Then let it be known." And with that, the wind carried the name forward. It touched the ears of the dying and the newly born. It slipped through the cloaks of the wandering jinn. It settled in the spaces between human dreams where angels sometimes wait to weep. Kayama, not a name, a vow. The name did not mean fire. It did not mean sun. It meant the rising that will not stop, and the world stirred. In places unseen, old prophets turned in their graves, not in restlessness, in recognition. In the bones of the mountain Aranor the empty throne hummed, and across the ash-choked plains 1,000 seeds split open. Luma stood beside him, silent. She did not need a name yet, for she had just witnessed something rare, the moment the world speaks back to the one who carried it, and for a breathless morning the fire did not burn, it danced. Then let us return to the breath of the earth, where names are not spoken, they are carried. Everywhere he walked, the land remembered him. It did not bloom, not yet, but it softened. The stones beneath his feet no longer cracked, they hummed. The air behind him shimmered faintly, not from heat but from recognition. For when the wind first whispered his name, Kayama, it did not stop at breath. It began to teach the world to sing, not in melody, in memory. A strange thing happened in the days that followed. Children began to stir from sleep with ashes on their fingers, though no fires had burned near them. Old women woke humming tunes they could not explain, their lips cracked from dryness, their hearts strangely warm. Even beasts, the desert jackal, the mountain lion, the skyhawk, began to travel toward the horizon he walked toward. They did not know why, they only knew they needed to be near him. And Luma, she felt it too. The more she walked beside him, the more the fire inside her shifted. It no longer trembled, it reached, toward the wind, toward the earth, toward the people. And then came the first ones to meet them, not giants, not angels, but those who still bled. 3 of them, wanderers. A mother, a crippled man, and a boy with no name. They had walked for 7 days through the ash, drawn by dreams they could not speak. And when they saw him, not his height, not his fire, but the grief in his eyes, they fell to their knees. The boy did not bow. He stepped forward, his eyes wide, his hands outstretched, empty. The giant bent low, not to threat, to listen. And the boy whispered, "I saw your back in my dream. It was carrying the sun, but you were crying. Why were you crying?" He did not answer. He only placed one hand on the boy's chest, and for a moment the fire passed through the child. Not to wound, to teach. The boy gasped, and then smiled, not because it felt good, because it felt true. He understood nothing and everything. The mother wept. The crippled man stood for the first time in years, his knees still trembling but steady, and Luma watched. The fire was changing, not just a burden now, a language. And with each step they took together, the fire began to leave traces in the world, small songs buried in soil, words written in dust, dreams planted in the minds of those who had forgotten how to hope. One night, beneath a sky too wide to name, Luma woke to find the stars singing. She couldn't hear the words, but she felt their rhythm in her ribs. It was a lullaby for the fire, a hymn for those who carry light without being asked. She turned to him, the giant, the bearer, the now named Kayama, and saw that he too was listening, eyes closed, shoulders still, not asleep, remembering, and far away where no one saw, the shadows stirred again, but they did not approach. Not yet, not while the world was learning to speak in flame. Then walk with me once more into the hush that forms when the world holds its breath, waiting for fire to become song. It began with the silence. Not absence, but a silence full of listening. The kind that comes before a storm or after a prayer. The kind that makes even time sit down and wait. They had reached the highest place between the valleys, a ridge where 3 winds crossed. One came from the north, sharp with old ice. One from the south, laced with memory of salt. The third from the east, the same wind that first spoke his name. It had returned. Kayama stood at the edge, his great hands resting on the cracked stone ledge, the sun at his back, steady, silent, golden. Luma stood behind him. Her hair danced in the wind, but her fire did not. It waited. And then it came, a shift, not in the ground, not in the sky, but in the air between them. The wind thickened, like breath before a cry. And then the sky whispered back. It was not thunder. It was not the voice of angels, nor the rage of fallen things. It was softer, like the breath of a mother leaning close to a newborn, and it said only this: "You are not alone." Kayama closed his eyes, and the sun on his back wept. Light spilled down his shoulders, not in fire but in rivers of warmth. The light reached Luma, then the stones, then the trees far below, then the fields yet untouched. And where the light fell, everything listened. Even the clouds parted, even the birds stilled, even the memories of those long buried beneath the soil turned toward the sound. The voice of the sky continued, now speaking not in words but in remembering. The breeze carried names long forgotten. The dust curled into shapes of ancient hands. The shadows fled without protest. And then the sky spoke again. You are the whisper between my breaths, the ember that did not die when others chose sleep. You are my echo wrapped in fire. Kayama bowed his head, not in pride, in awe, not of himself, but of the one who still remembered. He placed one hand to the ground and with his other reached back toward Luma. She did not hesitate, she took it. And in that moment the fire leapt. It did not split, it bridged. The flame between them became one breath, one heart, one prayer. And the sky, now stirred fully awake, spoke no more words. It began to sing. The wind rose and spun around them in rings, rings of light, rings of vow, rings of promise that the burden had never been in vain. And those watching from afar, the wanderers, the beasts, the mountains, the buried cities, they all saw it, two figures bound by flame. Not king and servant, not master and pupil, but elder and heir. And in that sacred fire the world began to hope again, not because the fire was perfect, but because it remained. And Kayama, for the first time in an age, did not feel heavy. He felt held by the wind, by the earth, by the child who stood beside him without flinching. And above all, by the silence that had finally spoken back. Then let us return once more into the sacred hush between flame and sky, where the fire begins to dream. No fire was ever meant to sleep. It is by nature a thing of motion, restless, hungry, ceaseless. But what of a fire that has burned too long? What of a flame that has carried sorrow instead of heat? What if even fire longs for stillness? They came to a grove one no map remembered, no caravan crossed. A hidden place folded inside a crease of the earth, where the trees still whispered in their original tongue and the air held no scent but silence. Kayama paused at its edge. His shadow reached forward before his foot did. The sun upon his back had dimmed, not out of weakness, out of tenderness. Luma followed. She carried her flame now like a second spine, light threading gently through her ribs, settling behind her eyes like a soft dawn. The moment they stepped inside the grove, something happened that had not happened in all the ages before. The fire softened. The birds did not flee. The trees did not bow. Even the wind was warm. It was as if the world, for this one moment, welcomed the flame. Kayama knelt beneath a gnarled fig tree whose roots wrapped like sleeping arms around forgotten stones. He placed both hands into the soil. It did not hiss. It did not recoil. It held him. Luma watched in silence. Then she too knelt not beside him but near. She faced the other direction as if to shield his back, as if to say, "You may rest, I will keep watch." And the fire, ancient, eternal, did the unthinkable. It slept. Not vanished, not extinguished, just paused. And in that pause Kayama dreamed. He had never dreamed before, not truly. But now he saw Azurael. Her hands dusted in gold, her feet dancing across rivers made of firelight, her voice. See, humming a tune the stars had tried to copy once. She was not lost. She was not gone. She was waiting, not in grief, in peace. And she said only this, "You have carried it long enough." But peace does not mean letting go. It means being carried in return. Then she reached out not to him, to Luma. And when Kayama turned in the dream, he saw the girl standing in the middle of 1,000 flames, and none of them burned her. They circled her like kin returning to their mother. They wove into her skin like tattoos of memory. They lit her hair until it shimmered with languages unspoken. She did not command them, she welcomed them. And then Kayama awoke, not startled, calm. The sun on his back stirred gently like a child waking without fear. Luma turned to him. Her eyes glowed, not wildly, softly. "You dreamed," she said. He nodded. "You glowed," he replied. She smiled. And far above them, unseen by both, the clouds folded into shapes that looked almost like wings. The fire had rested, and the world did not fall apart. Perhaps, he thought, perhaps it never needed to burn forever. Perhaps peace was not the end of flame, only the reason it chose to rise again. Then come again into the hush of holy embers, for the fire is waking gently and the world is holding its breath. Somewhere in the western dark, far from the grove where flame had slept, the shadow stirred. It had watched them, not from afar, from underneath. It had slipped beneath their footprints, clung to the underside of leaves, hidden inside the silence of night birds. It had not expected the flame to rest, and it hated what it could not predict, for if the fire could rest, then it could leave. And if it could leave, then someone else might carry it, someone not made of sorrow, not cloaked in regret, someone new. The shadow feared this most. It had always hunted fire in motion, chased it, shamed it, wounded it, but peace could not be stalked, so it came crawling, not with fury, with mimicry. It entered the grove in the shape of wind. It touched the outer bark of the trees. It slipped between the cracks of moss. It whispered to the stones beneath Luma's feet. And then it took the shape of a girl, not her reflection, her echo. Same eyes, same hair, same stance, but hollow, like something shaped from fog and absence. The false Luma stepped from the trees. Kayema was still seated, his eyes closed, his hands pressed gently into the soil. The flame on his back pulsed slow, dreaming still. The real Luma had risen with the dawn. She had wandered to the far edge of the grove to listen to the sun rise in solitude. She did not see the shadow slip past. False Luma stepped closer to Kayema, kneeled beside him, spoke not with her voice but with something almost like it. It's time to pass it on. You've carried it long enough. Let me bear it now and rest forever. He stirred. The dream began to fade. Azurael's voice drifted like birdsong into silence. The grove darkened subtly. The warmth withdrew. He opened his eyes and he saw her, but the fire did not rise. It quivered. And that was how he knew. She had touched him before many times, and never had the fire flinched. But now it recoiled, softly, quietly, but surely. He placed one hand on her cheek. The false one smiled, but her skin was cold, too cold. He looked deeper, not with his eyes, but with the light behind them. And he saw it, the shape of envy, the scent of rot, the whisper of doubt where love should have lived. He spoke, not loud, but true. You are not her. The shadow hissed. Its mouth split into something too wide. Its arms fell into smoke. Its hair unraveled into strands of ash, but it did not flee. This time it lunged, straight toward his chest, toward the dream still echoing there, and just before it reached him she returned, the real Luma, running, not with fear, with fire. The light in her chest flared, not red, not gold, but white. The kind of light only born when peace meets courage. She leapt forward, her hand outstretched, and the fire answered her. It left Kayema only for a breath and wrapped around her like armor. It struck the shadow midair. The grove screamed. The wind tore through branches. Leaves flew like broken wings, and the shadow shattered not into pieces but into silence. It did not die, but it forgot itself. It drifted, it wept, it vanished. And Luma stood there, breathless, her hands smoking, her eyes full of stars. Kayema did not rise. He only looked at her and said softly, "You dreamed too." She nodded. Tears touched her cheeks. But they did not steam. They cooled. And the fire rested again, not out of exhaustion, out of trust. Then come closer once more, for even fire must learn how to rise without fear, and light must choose whom it loves. The grove was still, but not with fear, with knowing. The trees no longer held their breath. The earth no longer flinched beneath the weight of flame. The wind no longer whispered only warnings. All things now listened differently because the fire had made a choice. It had seen the shadow try to mimic love. It had seen the girl stand between memory and loss, and it had stayed, not because it had to, but because it wanted to. Kayema sat beneath the fig tree, his breath deep, the light on his back soft as cloth soaked in gold. His eyes were open, but they did not search. They watched her, Luma, kneeling near the stone where she had cast the shadow away, her palms still glowing faintly with the light that had risen for her alone. She did not look at him yet. She was trembling, not with pain, with realization. She had held the fire. She had spoken with it, not through words but through essence. And now she knew This burden was never meant to be carried alone. Kayama finally spoke. The fire rested in you. She nodded, and it did not leave. He tilted his head as though listening for something in the air. It's never stayed before. She looked up. Then maybe it was waiting for me. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with something sacred, like the pause between a promise and its keeping. Then he stood, not as a giant, as a man who had known every kind of weight. The sun stirred on his back, but gently, like an elder stepping aside for its air. He walked toward her and she rose without flinching. He reached for her hands. And in the moment their palms met, the fire rose. Not between them, through them. It spiraled into the trees, which did not burn. It sank into the roots, which did not curl. It touched the sky, and the clouds folded back to reveal stars, though it was not yet night. The fire did not rage, it remembered. And what it remembered was this: peace is not the end of burden. It is the space in which burden becomes meaning. They stood together at the center of the grove, one with fire on his back, one with fire in her breath. And the wind that had once whispered his name now whispered hers, not loudly, just enough for the leaves to catch. Nur. She turned her face toward the voice. Kayama watched her. That is not your name, he said. She smiled. It's the name of what I've become. And the fire pulsed, soft, strong, alive. Then they sat side by side. The sun dipped lower in the sky, but it did not set, not yet. It paused, hovering just above the horizon, waiting. The world had seen fire rise in fury. It had seen it fall in ruin. But now, for the first time since the heavens had been split by choice and sorrow, the world watched the fire stay. Not to destroy, not to command, but to belong. And in that quiet grove, beneath roots tangled with memory, Kayama and Nur closed their eyes, not in sleep, in peace. And somewhere beyond the veil of wind and ash, Azurael wept, but not from mourning, from joy. Then let us walk once more into the hush between breath and flame, where peace is no longer a dream, but the soil from which destiny begins to rise. It lay beyond the burnt valleys, past the rivers that no longer spoke, past the mountains whose names had long since been traded for silence. The city. Not ruined, not ancient, alive, but hollow. Its towers still reached like fingers to the sky, its courtyards still bloomed with thorned gardens, its people still bartered dreams for coin. But no one remembered the fire, not the real one. They remembered its shadow. They wore gold charms shaped like suns. They hung mirrors from windows to catch the light. They lit candles at dusk, not for prayer, but for appearance. They knew warmth, but not the one who bore it. And so when Kayama entered their gates with the sun still resting upon his shoulders like a faithful bird, they did not bow. They did not flee, they laughed. Children pointed at the giant with eyes wide and giggles sharp. Men whispered of his scars. Women turned their faces, unwilling to meet the gaze of someone who carried what they had long abandoned. Only the dogs knew. They howled when he passed, not in fear, in reverence. And the blind beggar at the temple steps wept. He could feel the fire in his bones, the kind that once burned in the days before stories were called myths. Kayama walked slowly. He did not speak. He did not cast judgment. He only carried. And beside him, Nur walked with bare feet, her own flame dimmed beneath a cloak of dust, hidden for now, silent. The city was called Myark, once known as the City of Light. Long ago, it had been a gathering place for the flame-touched, those who built with fire, who healed with heat, who prayed beside rivers of gold. But they had grown clever, too clever. They began to cage the fire, to sell it, to tame it with words that were never sacred. And when the last flame left them, they replaced it with mirrors. Their gods became reflections. Their prayers became performances. Their warmth became memory. And now, when the true fire returned to them, not in wrath but in mercy, they could not recognize it. Kayama stood in the center of their market. The sun flared softly behind him. No one saw, no one looked except the old beggar. He dragged himself forward, hands trembling, his eyes clouded but his soul open. He fell at Kayama's feet and whispered, "It has come back, hasn't it?" Kayama knelt. "It never left." The man sobbed, and Nur placed her hand upon his shoulder. A single pulse of light passed from her to him, not enough to heal, just enough to remind. And the old man saw, not with his eyes, with his remains. He saw a throne in a mountain, a grove that held no fear, a woman who bore fire like a lullaby. He saw the weight on Kayema's back, and he wept harder, but the people, they looked away. The market buzzed on, coins clinked, perfume curled into the air, and the fire stood among them, offering warmth without words, and was not received. Nur leaned close. They do not want it. Kayema looked up at the building, so tall, so pale, so empty. Not yet. And the sun above them paused in its rise, hovering just behind his shoulders, waiting for someone, anyone, to turn around. But none did, and so the fire stayed quiet, and the city missed its second chance. Then come, for we now walk into a city that chose reflection over flame, and silence over the voice that once called it sacred. Night fell gently over Myrick, the kind of night that seemed soft but was hollow. The lanterns were lit along its narrow streets, each one dangling from silk-wrapped iron poles, each flame small, trapped behind colored glass. The city glowed, yes, but not from within. And still no one saw the sun that hovered behind the shoulders of Kayema, or the silver fire beneath the feet of Nur. No one looked up. They had mirrors, but they had covered them. At twilight, it was custom in Myrick for every home to hang a cloth over their reflective glass, not out of reverence, out of shame. For when the light dimmed, the people no longer wished to see themselves. Their faces, without the glow of false fire, showed too much. Lines they had earned with dishonor, eyes dulled by centuries of forgetfulness, lips that had not whispered a real prayer since the last true flame left their city gates. They had forgotten, and forgetting is its own kind of curse. Kayema walked with bare feet upon their polished stone. He left no soot, no ash, only heat, kind that sank into the walls and made children restless in their sleep. He passed through the alleys. He passed the baker kneeling in front of a dying oven. He passed the boy painting false stars on the side of his home. He passed the shrine that once burned with sacred oil, now cold, and with him came Nur, her presence quieter like a windless lamp, but everywhere she passed the walls warmed. The rats fled to the corners. The shadows curled back into the cracks they had come from. Still, no one saw them. Except three. An old woman, a mute girl, and a man who had once carried the fire, long ago, and buried it. The old woman sat at the city's edge, crushing herbs with fingers that trembled. She lifted her eyes as Kayema passed. She said nothing, but she bowed her head. Her hair lit for just a moment, not from his flame, but from the memory it pulled out of her bones. She had once been a healer, one who used flame to draw sickness from the blood. She had been punished for it, branded, her mouth sewn shut with silence. But now the warmth returned to her palms, and though she said nothing, she wept. The mute girl saw Nur. She had never spoken, not since birth, not even laughter. But when Nur looked at her, just looked, the girl blinked twice, and light passed between them. Not a gift, a recognition. And the man, he stood at the highest tower, watching from behind a silk-draped balcony. He had once trained with the fire-bearers of the Old East, but when the mirrors came, he turned away. Now he wore a golden cloak and called himself Judge of Light. He saw Kayema pass beneath him. He felt his knees shake, but he did not descend. He turned from the window, and the cloth over his mirror fell. And for the first time in 30 years, his reflection stared back at him without flinching. And he fell to the floor, not dead, but broken. In the street below, Kayema paused. He looked up once. He said nothing. But the fire on his back curled gently around his neck like a scarf and warmed the earth beneath him until vines rose between the cracks. He whispered, so soft it became the air, "There is still one who remembers." And Nur whispered back, "That is enough." The moon rose, not bright, but clearer than it had in decades. And in the homes where the mirrors remained uncovered, the people dreamt of thrones in mountains and suns that could weep. Then let us return one last time to Myrick, where forgotten fire stirs beneath silk-covered eyes and the truth begins to tremble under polished stone. It was just before dawn, that fragile hour when the sky is neither dark nor light, only waiting. Myrick was quiet. No ma. Arquette cries. No chimes. Only the faint, muffled breathing of 1,000 homes where truth had long been tucked beneath woven rugs and incense smoke. Kayama stood at the center of the city beneath the tower of mirrors, his back to the people. The sun had not risen, but it was awake. He felt it stirring across his shoulders, felt its warmth slide like honey down the ridges of his spine. He knew what it meant. It was time to leave. Beside him, Nur remained still. Her flame was low now, not dimmed, anchored. The kind of fire that waits, that listens, that learns the rhythm of the world before it speaks again. Neither of them moved. They waited. And slowly, as if pulled by something older than curiosity, the people began to gather. Not many. A few at first. A child who had dreamt of birds made of gold. A blind man who felt his feet grow warm in the night. An elder who had not left her home in 20 winters. They came, and they said nothing. Because something about the way he stood, tall, straight, facing east, told them that silence was the only thing sacred enough to offer. Still, he did not turn. He did not speak. He let them see his back, let them see the scars. Let them see the sun no longer flaming but resting, like a great lion folded over his shoulders. And one by one the people who gathered began to weep, not from fear, from recognition. The children, born to glass and mirror, felt something stir in their ribs. Not pain, memory, as if their bones were remembering a warmth that predated their birth. The old ones began to hum melodies their parents had sung beside real fire. And one voice, cracked and unsure, rose from the crowd. "You carried it all this way," another followed. "We thought fire was only for punishment," and another. "Why does it still shine if we forgot it?" Kayama said nothing. Instead, he stepped forward just once, and the sun behind him flared wide, not to blind, but to wake. It passed over the crowd like a warm tide, and for the first time they did not cover their mirrors, they opened them. Silk veils pulled back, dust wiped from glass. And in those mirrors they saw not their own faces, they saw his, reflected in light, not as a god, not as a monster, as a man. One who carried flame across a world that no longer believed in it. One who had walked into silence and never stopped walking. He turned slowly, not to speak, to offer. His eyes met theirs. And though his face was lined with ancient grief, there was no bitterness, only fire. Steady, alive, he raised his hand not in command, in farewell, and the sun rose behind him. Not from the horizon, but from his shoulders, and it rose higher than it had in 100 years. And Myrick changed, not in stone, in heart. Some would forget again, but not all. And as Kayama and Nur walked out of the city gates, bare feet against warm stone, no one stopped them, no one bowed, no one asked questions. They just watched, in reverence. In silence. And for the rest of their lives, the people of Myrick would remember not the words he spoke, but the back that bore the sun. And the girl beside him who carried flame like it was meant to stay. Then let us return again to where the fire walks without anger and the earth begins to follow its warmth like a prayer. There are roads not carved by hand, not paved with stone, but formed by the memory of footsteps too sacred to forget. They call them paths of the carriers. And long after Kayama and Nur left Myrick, the road behind them did not fade. It glowed, not bright, not boastful, but steady like embers beneath ash, like a line of breath between the chest and the stars. They walked in silence. The fire did not blaze, it listened. And beneath their feet the stones began to shift. Tiny fragments lifted, cracks rearranged. What had once been nothing but barren dust became a trail that shimmered in the morning light. The earth was remembering. Each step they took carved more than distance. It carved truth. They passed through forgotten fields where the bones of old vineyards whispered blessings in the wind. They passed through ravines where the screams of ancient giants still lingered, caught between sorrow and sky. But no beast stirred. No storm dared speak, because the fire was moving. And the world had learned what that meant. Nur walked ahead that morning, her step sure, her eyes open, and the flame within her moved like breath inside a sleeping child, gentle, strong, never ceasing. Behind her, Kayama walked slow. His back still bore the sun, but something had changed. It was lighter now, not because the burden had weakened, but because she now walked before it, and that changed everything. Midday rose like gold over the hills, and as they crested a ridge of black stone, they saw them, the pilgrims, dozens at first, then hundreds, travelers from villages neither had spoken to, some barefoot, some blind, some wearing robes made of stitched ash and linen. They walked the path behind them, not out of worship but out of remembrance. The stones had whispered their names, the fire had passed beneath their dreams, and now they walked toward it, not to claim it, to learn from it. Kayama turned to Nur. "You opened the road." She shook her head. "It was already there, we just made it honest again." And so they slowed, not to wait, but to allow the path to breathe. One of the pilgrims stepped forward, a girl no older than 7, carrying nothing but a clay bowl of river water. Approached Nur with trembling hands, offered it. Nur took it, not with reverence, with equality. She drank and returned the bowl. The girl smiled, and the flame in Nur's chest flickered in response. Recognition. Lineage. Kayama looked at the gathering crowd, the footprints layered behind theirs like music written into the dust, and he knelt, pressed his palm to the ground. The fire spread gently beneath the stones, not to scorch but to sing, and all across the earth a sound rose, low, soft, old, like drums made of memory. The stones were singing, each footfall now echoed not as sound but as story, and the road itself from Myrick to the sea began to pulse, not for kings, not for armies, but for those who carried something, a burden, a love, a truth they could not yet name. The fire had always moved in silence. Now it moved in song, and the world listened. Then walk with me again, for the path has awakened, and the fire now travels with those who dare remember. They came to a crossroads, not of stone, of spirit. The road split not in direction but in intention. One path curved down into the valley of old sanctuaries where temples once made of salt and bone still whispered beneath dust. The other climbed, steep and narrow, toward the edge of the burning cliffs, a place where no one had walked in 1,000 years. The pilgrims behind them waited, not out of hesitation, out of trust. They would follow wherever the fire turned. And that is when he came, not with noise, with charm. A man draped in white, his garments flowing like clouds, his eyes sharp with polish. He bore no dust on his feet, no scar across his cheek. But the way he moved lightly, like he belonged to nothing, told Kayama all he needed. He was one who had never carried fire, only borrowed it. The man approached them as though arriving late to a feast. He bowed deeply to Kayama and spoke. "You've done well. The path behind you sings. The people follow. But now it is time to rest. Let me take the flame forward." Kayama said nothing. The man turned to Nur. "You're young, you shouldn't bear such heat, let me carry it for a while." And Nur felt it then, not heat, cold, slipping beneath her ribs, sliding behind her thoughts. The same cold that speaks not with violence but with ease. The man's smile widened. "I know the way, I have maps, I've built temples for light. I've taught the names of fire to those who forgot. Let me walk ahead." Kayama stepped between them. The fire on his back flared, not in wrath, in warning. The man raised his hands. "I mean no harm, I only wish to guide what you've begun." And then softly Kayama asked, "Have you ever burned?" The man blinked. "What?" Kayama stepped closer. "Have you carried it so long it carved rivers into your back? Have you wept with the sun begging not to rise? Have you loved something so fiercely it lit your bones from within?" The man's eyes flickered just once. That was enough. Kayama nodded. "Then you may not guide what you have not endured." The man's face soured. For just a breath the illusion fell. Beneath the silk the skin was cracked. Beneath the smile there was hunger. Beneath the offered hand a leash. The crowd behind them saw it too. The girl with the clay bowl stepped back. The old woman with no teeth made a sign in the air. And Nur, she stepped forward. Fire rose in her voice, not loud, steady. "We do not follow ease, we follow flame." And at that word the wind turned. The man stepped back. The road rejected him. His foot pressed into the stone, but the earth did not hold him. He slipped, not into death, into silence. The kind reserved for those who touch the sacred without reverence. And the pilgrim stood quiet. Kayama looked to Nur. You led the fire well." She did not smile, she simply turned east, and the road, as if stirred by her choice, aligned. The path forward shimmered once more, and they walked on. The fire never looked back. Then come, for the fire has chosen its path, and now the world begins to remember how to follow. It had never seen the ocean, not truly, not as it was now, a vast sheet of silence, folded upon itself like an old robe laid over the bones of giants. The sea stretched wide before them, horizon soft and trembling, waves moving with breath but no voice. Kayama stood at the shore, his feet pressed into salt-wet sand, the fire on his back whispering quiet pulses across his skin. Nur stood beside him, her cloak rippling like flame against the breeze, her eyes fixed on the line where the world disappeared. Behind them the road had ended, or so it seemed, but the fire stirred, not forward, downward, beneath the sand, beneath the water. Kayama knelt and pressed his hand into the sea's edge. The wave did not recoil, it warmed, not boiled, warmed. And the sea began to sing, not aloud, but in memory. It sang of other bearers, of fire once hidden beneath its waves, of oaths whispered into the tides by those who had passed unseen. And in that moment the ocean recognized him, not as a threat, as a returning. A tide broke softly across his hands, and in its foam letters formed. Not human, not jinn, something older, a language only the fire could read. Kayama bowed his head, and the flame pulsed. It remembered, a promise made before even the first sun rose. That one day the fire would meet the water, and they would not destroy one another. They would bless. He looked to Nur. "This is where it goes next." She nodded. "Will it cross?" He shook his head. "No, it will sink." And as she watched, he stepped into the water, first his feet, then his knees, then his chest. The fire on his back did not flinch, it brightened. The sea glowed gold where he passed. Fish rose near the surface. Clouds parted above. The sun paused in its climb. And then when the water reached his neck, he stopped, turned, faced the shore, faced her, Nur, his heir, his sister in fire. Echo. He raised one hand. She did not cry, but the flame behind her eyes trembled. He spoke. "It will choose others. You must teach them not how to carry it, but how to love it." She stepped forward. "And you?" He smiled, faint as ash before wind. "I will go where it began." And with one final breath he sank. The flame did not die, it shimmered below the waves, it danced across the surface, and then it spread, not upward, outward, beneath, across. The ocean glowed faintly for miles. The sea carried him, and on the shore Nur turned to the pilgrims. They had not cried, they had not spoken, they had only watched. And now they knelt, everyone, even the children, not in grief. In awe, the fire had touched the sea, and the sea had bowed. Nur turned her face eastward, the wind circled her feet, and far beneath the waves the fire waited, not gone, not lost, only planted, and someday, when the world is ready again, it will rise. Then come again, for the sea still glows beneath its silence, and the fire waits in the deep, not to burn, but to return. The mountains had forgotten what warmth felt like. They had grown sharp with waiting, hollowed by the echoes of prayers never answered, carved by winds that had lost their language. But then the earth trembled, not from wrath, not from collapse, from arrival. The fire had sunk, not to vanish, to move beneath. It flowed now through caverns older than memory, slipping between roots and buried bones, curling beneath the feet of creatures who had only ever known cold. And the mountains stirred. In a forgotten range where no city stood, where no name was carved into stone, a stone split. Not wide, not loudly, just enough. And warmth rose from the crack, a breath of golden mist, and a child saw it. She had come there chasing silence, drawn by a dream of voices that spoke in light. She had no mother. She had no father. Only a thin scarf and the ashes she carried in a clay bowl, ashes from a village lost to frost 2 winters ago. But when she placed the bowl upon the cracked stone, the warmth rose gently, wrapped itself around the rim, and whispered without words. She knelt, not because she was told, because something inside her remembered. And then a flicker, in her palms, a pulse of gold. The fire had touched her, not to command, to awaken. Far below her feet, where Kayama's memory now drifted through molten halls, the fire recognized her sorrow. And sorrow is a door, not a lock, so it opened. Nur, walking far away across the low hills of the east, felt it instantly. She stopped mid-step, her fire flaring softly inside her chest. "Another," she whispered. The people walking with her paused, a boy with a walking stick, a woman who carried herbs that glowed, a man who hadn't spoken in days but now looked up, eyes wide. They felt it too. Something new had begun. Not another bearer, not yet, but a listener. Someone whose pain was clean enough to hold flame. Someone who would not use it, but welcome it. And deep in the mountain, the fire grew quiet, not because it was retreating, because it had arrived. It touched stone, touched memory, and began to leave behind marks, not a fire, of hope. For years the mountains had cracked from cold. Now they healed from within, and across the world the rivers began to run warm again. Then come again, for the fire has found its way beneath the skin of the world, and those who carry grief may now carry warmth. She did not have a name they remembered. The village that had named her was. Ash now scattered across the mountain wind like the last breath of an old lullaby, but the fire knew her. Not by title, by ache. It moved beneath her as she slept on the stone, beneath a sky cracked with stars, beneath silence so wide it could hold all her sorrow without spilling. And as she dreamed, the ashes in her clay bowl stirred. They had once been her mother's touch, her brother's song, the wooden walls of her home. Now they were dust, but dust can still remember fire. She dreamt of a hand, huge, calloused, and kind, reaching down from a sky lit in gold. It did not lift her. It offered, in its palm, a single coal, still glowing, still breathing. And when she took it, it did not burn. It hummed. She woke in the blue hour of dawn. The bowl beside her glowed faintly, a soft shimmer rising from the ashes as if they too had woken. The ground beneath her was warm, not hot, not threatening, welcoming. She placed both hands into the ashes. The moment her fingers touched, the fire within the earth rose, not up, inward. It entered her palms like mist soaked into cloth. It found the cracks between her ribs. It curled behind her eyes. She did not cry, she breathed. And the fire recognized her not as a savior, as a sanctuary. In that moment, far across the plains, Nur stopped walking. She fell to her knees. The people behind her gasped. But she was not in pain, she was listening. The fire was speaking. It had chosen another. And it did not rise in the sky. It rose in the soil, she whispered. It has planted itself in her. The boy beside her knelt. Who is she? Nur did not answer. She had no name, only flame, and that was enough. Back in the mountain the girl stood, barefoot, covered in ash, but no longer alone. The fire had woven itself into her blood, but it did not burn. It waited. And as she walked down the mountain path, each stone beneath her feet warmed, not in heat, in recognition. The birds flew lower, the clouds parted, and from within the deepest chamber of the earth, where Kayama's last breath still drifted like perfume, the fire sang. Then come, for the fire has found her, and now the earth begins to carry what heaven once wept. The fire had never flowed like this. It had walked, it had waited, it had wept, but now it moved. Not as a torch, not as a sun, as a river, beneath stone, beneath root, beneath the silence of a world too afraid to hope. It did not burn the way it once did. It warmed, it remembered, and it carried the girl with it. She walked through the old valleys, her bowl of ashes now pulsing with golden breath. No one walked with her, but she was not alone. Where she stepped, the grass turned the color of olive oil at dusk, not green, ancient. Old flowers bloomed in her wake, ones no one had named in generations, ones that only opened when flame had touched the rain. She passed through a village that had forgotten speech. They stared as she moved. Some bowed, some cried. A child reached out and whispered, "She's glowing." She did not stop, not yet, for the fire within her was not ready to rest. It was searching. And when she reached the place where the river had died, choked by stone, buried beneath collapse, cut off by those who feared its flood, she knelt, not to pray, to remember. She placed the bowl of ashes into the dry bed, pressed her hand to the stone, and said nothing. But the fire heard her, and it rose. Not as flame, as water. the earth opened, not violently, like it had been waiting. A thread of warmth slid through the cracks, then a trickle, then a hum. And before the villagers could gather, before the elders could name what was happening, the river returned. Not from rain, from below it came golden, silent, alive, and in its current light, not fire, not flood, just life. The kind that has waited too long to be welcomed. The kind that only flows when sorrow turns into offering. Far away, Nur stood upon a high place and watched. The wind told her what the river could not. She whispered, "She's not a bearer." The man beside her looked up. "Then what is she?" Nur smiled. "A well." And from her palms a thread of flame rose gently. It passed into the wind, into the soil, into the stars. Kayama's journey had reached its roots. And now from those roots a river flowed. And somewhere deep beneath the mountain, in chambers that remembered every oath ever made in silence, the fire rested. Not because it had finished, but because it had finally found where it belonged. Then return once more to the hush beneath the stars, for the fire has become a river and the world begins to rise from beneath its own silence. There were people beneath the earth, not buried, waiting. They had built no cities, they had carved no names. They had spoken only once long ago when the fire passed over them and said, "Not yet." And so they had slept, in stone-wrapped silence. In chambers folded beneath mountains, beneath rivers, beneath the bones of the first giants who fell before He flood. Their hearts beat once every 100 seasons. Their lungs held breath the way caves hold echoes, gently, without urgency. They were not dead, they were kept. Preserved by mercy, guarded by flame, hidden so that when the time came they could remember what others had forgotten. And now the time had come. The fire moved beneath them. It was no longer a burden, no longer a sword, no longer a shout from heaven. It was a song, and it stirred them. Fingers curled, eyes blinked. Breath returned to ribs carved from dust and vow. They opened their eyes not to light but to warmth, and each of them wept without sound. Not from pain, from recognition. They rose slowly, not as warriors, as witnesses. Each bore a mark on their chest, a small, ancient burn that had never faded. The sign of the flame, not given by man, not branded by angel, given by God in the time before memory. In the time when the fire first asked, "Who will still carry me when the world forgets?" And these were the ones who answered, not with speeches, not with banners, but with stillness. They had chosen not to rise until the flame called them by name, and now it had. The girl who had become the well stood by the river. She felt it in her spine, in her teeth, in her blood. Their waking. Nur felt it too, though she walked now across lands far to the south. Every step sang louder. The earth beneath her feet pulsed with movement. The road was stirring. The fire had called, and the forgotten were rising. 1 by 1, 10 by 10. 1,000 souls not clothed in armor but in silence. They emerged from the caves, from dry wells, from the hollow hearts of hills, eyes glowing with soft gold, not bright, not demanding, but ready. They looked to the sky where the sun rose quiet and low, and they did not squint, they simply nodded. They had been waiting for its return, and now they would walk, not ahead, not behind, but with the flame, for they were not its masters, they were its memory. And the fire had not forgotten them. Then come again, for those who slept are walking now, and the fire moves with a memory too old to silence. It began without a trumpet, no call, no command, just footsteps, soft ones, like leaves falling in rhythm, like time choosing to walk beside itself. They came from the west and the deep, from ravines that had not seen stars in an age, from wells sealed with stone and prayer, from beneath the hills where birds never flew, the keepers, the quiet ones, those who had slept with the flame etched beneath their skin. They did not ask where to go. They walked toward it, the fire, not toward a throne, not toward power, but toward warmth, the kind that says, "You are still part of the vow." Nur saw them first. She stood on the hill known only as Zara's bone, where no trees grew and no roots dared wander. She had climbed it barefoot, drawn by a sound she did not hear but felt. And when she reached the top, she looked out and wept. Hundreds, then thousands, a tide of quiet faces, eyes glowing like coals from long-forgotten hearths. No one spoke, not even the wind. They did not need speech. Their presence was the language. She stepped forward. The fire in her chest reached toward them. It leapt from her in golden threads, spanning the sky like strands of honeyed silk. And one by one they were woven in. Not as servants, not as soldiers, but as witnesses. And when they came to her, they did not kneel. They stopped, stood, and placed one hand to their own heart, then to hers. It was the oldest greeting of the fire, a vow that predates angels. One keeper, his hair white as clouds that no longer weep, looked into her eyes. "You carry the river." She nodded. "I carry what he gave." The keeper looked up at the sky. "Then you carry us too." And he stepped aside, not behind her, beside. And they walked on. The trail behind them pulsed with warmth, not heat, promise. From high ridges and low valleys, the rest of the world began to see it, the great procession. The fire had taken form, not as destruction, as memory, and with every step more rose to join, not out of fear, out of belonging. And the path they left behind, it glowed for days. Even after their feet were gone, the earth remembered their weight. And beneath the soil, the flame curled itself into roots. It was making ready for something the sky had not seen in 1,000 ages, something that even the stars had forgotten. The flame was not gathering for war. It was gathering for return. Then let us walk once more into the hush of rising embers, for the fire is no longer alone and the world is beginning to remember why it was lit. They came to a clearing no map had marked. It was not large. It was not sacred. Not yet. It was only space, stone, soil. A circle worn smooth by the absence of anything important, but the fire knew it. The moment Nur stepped across its edge, her flame dimmed. Not in fear, in reverence. This was the place where the fire had first paused, not in Ayama's time, not even in the age of giants. Before that, when the flame had been young, before it was burden, before it was vow, before it knew sorrow, it had rested here. And now so would they. Nur entered the circle. The keepers followed. No one spoke. They took their places around her, not to worship but to witness. And she sat, in the center, upon a stone so cracked it looked as though a heart had once broken there. She placed her hands in her lap, closed her eyes. Fire inside her pulsed 3 times. And then it sat down too, not within her, around her. A ring of gold spun from breath and grief and memory. It spread slowly, a perfect circle drawn with no hands. The moment it touched the edge of the clearing, the wind halted. The birds stopped mid-flight, and even the shadows softened. The fire had chosen this place, not as throne, not as battlefield, as hearth. For the first time since the sun had been carried upon Kayama's back, the fire had nowhere to go. And it was not afraid. Nur opened her eyes. She looked to the keepers. It does not want to be carried. They nodded. It wants to be kept. And so they stayed. Some sat, some stood. One old woman began to hum, a sound so old it cracked the teeth of the silence. And in her voice the fire danced. From every corner of the circle, embers began to rise. No fuel, no wood, only breath, only faith. And as the fire sat and the people waited, the sky began to change. Not the stars, not the clouds, the color. The light above shifted from silver to rose, from rose to bronze, from bronze to deep, holy gold. The same hue the fire had carried when it first rose in the bones of Kayama. And in that sky no comet flew, no angel descended, only stillness. Stillness that hummed. The girl who had once carried ashes knelt beside Nur. She placed her clay bowl on the earth, and the fire reached for it, not to consume, to honor. And from the ashes in that bowl a flower bloomed, the first ever born from a flame. Its petals flickered but never burned. It smelled of rain that hadn't fallen yet, of a dawn not yet named. And far beneath the circle, in the river of fire where Kayama's breath still curled, the embers sighed. The fire was no longer searching. It had found what it had never dared ask for, belonging. Then walk with me one last time, for the fire has found its rest, and now we will remember how the world ends and how it begins again. It had always risen. That was the first law of fire. No matter how heavy the silence, how long the dark, how deep the grave, it rose. But not now, not here. In the clearing of ash and song, where the keepers circled the one who bore the breath of the old flame, where the flower of smoke and gold bloomed without fear, the fire did not rise. It remained, not because it was weak, because it had chosen stillness. Because for the first time in all the story of things, the world did not need a torch. It needed a hearth. Nur sat cross-legged in the center of the circle, her hands resting in the soil, her eyes half closed, neither in sleep nor trance. She was listening. Fire was quiet inside her, not gone, not dim, present like a friend who no longer needs to shout to be heard. Around her, the keepers began to place their hands into the soil, one by one, without instruction. And from beneath the surface, threads of warmth began to rise, light like veins of gold moving through the body of the world. They pulsed gently, every beat a vow, every beat a memory. The earth, once scorched by ambition, once frozen by betrayal, now began to glow, not across its sky, within its bones. And in every corner of the circle the people felt it, even those who had never borne flame, even the children born from those who had forgotten. Even the beasts at the forest's edge who watched with patient eyes, they felt it, the shift, the surrender. The fire was no longer a visitor to the earth. It had made its home. And far beyond the circle, across the deserts, through the ancient valleys, above the mountains where snow still clung like sorrow, the old altars crumbled, not in defeat, in release. They had been waiting for the fire to return to the sky, but it had returned to the soil. And it would rise no more because it no longer had to. In the West, a prophet who had waited in silence for 40 years stood barefoot on a cracked stone and wept, not because the fire was lost, but because it had stayed. And staying is the holiest thing light can do. Then return once more into the hush that only embers understand, for the flame has sat down, and now the world begins to gather around it. They no longer walked. There was no need. The path had come to them. The keepers, the children, the ones who had burned and the ones who had waited, all of them now stood in a wide ring, a circle so perfect it could not be drawn, only remembered. In the center sat Nur, her hands still open to the soil, her breath slow, her flame quiet but endless. It did not flicker anymore, it wove. The fire had become a thread now, one that moved from heart to heart, without smoke, without ash. It had no beginning, no flame head, no crown, just warmth. And from the edges of the circle, new things began to grow, not cities, not temples, but resting places. Flat stones arranged without names, pillars shaped like hands folded in prayer, seeds buried not for food but for memory. This was not the building of a kingdom. It was the making of a home. And in that home there would be no thrones, only circles. The girl who once carried the ashes now carried water. She poured it gently where the flower bloomed and the petals did not wither, they opened wider. In the distance, an old wanderer placed his pack on the ground, his walking staff across his knees, and sat down. He whispered, "I have walked my last mile." And the fire pulsed beneath his feet as if to say, "Welcome." They came from everywhere, the forgotten, the betrayed, the burned, the silent. They gathered slowly, not in haste. The fire does not summon, it invites. And the invitation had gone out not in words but in warmth. Now they came. And every soul who sat at the circle's edge felt the same thing. They were no longer alone. Kayama's name was never spoken aloud, but in the wind his breath was still present. In the soil his sorrow had become seed. In the fire his memory curled like light within every whisper. And in Nur's stillness he lived. She did not lead, she held. And when one child came and sat beside her, placing a small stone in her lap, she smiled. And the fire pulsed once more. The sun rose that day without flame, not because it had gone out, because it had come home. And the world, it turned gently, slow, cradled by warmth it no longer feared. Then come one final time into the stillness where stories are no longer told but kept. Night fell without fear. No wind howled. No stars hid. Even the silence was soft, not the silence of absence, but the silence of arrival. The fire had stayed. And because it had stayed, so had the people. They sat in the circle. They tended no altars. They built no walls. They simply kept the flame alive, not with oil, not with ritual, but with presence. They shared, they listened, and sometimes they wept, but their tears did not sizzle in flame. They soaked the soil, and from that soil came wildflowers that had never bloomed before. Each petal held a story. And every morning when the dew kissed them, they whispered it back to the sky. Nur rose before the others did. She walked barefoot around the ring, checking the soil with her hands, pressing her palms to the earth. She did not command, she watched. She did not raise her voice, she remembered. And when she returned to the center, she found a child waiting for her. He held a spark, not a flame, just a single breathing ember cupped in his hands. He offered it without speaking, and Nur understood. "You are ready," the boy nodded. She did not ask his name, she did not tell him where to go, she only breathed upon the ember once, and it pulsed. The boy held it gently and walked, not away from the fire, but with it, to the north where frost still lingered, to the cities that had forgotten how to sit still, to the towers that reflected light but had long lost heat. He would not build altars, he would not start a war, he would simply carry warmth. And wherever he sat, the fire would sit too. This is how it would continue, not as a blaze, not as a throne, but as 1,000 circles gathered quietly around an ember that had once walked the world in sorrow and chosen not to vanish but to stay. And so the fire lived on, in silence, in song, in soil, and in souls that remembered what it cost to rise and what it meant to rest. And beneath it all, the earth pulsed softly, not with power, with peace.